Live each day with courage. Take pride in your work. Always finish what you start. Do what has to be done. Be tough, but fair. When you make a promise, keep it. Ride for the brand. Talk less and say more. Remember that some things aren't for sale. Know where to draw the line. I'm Chris Pivey,
And I'm Eddy Webb.
and today we're here to talk about the Western film genre on Genreless. At long
Yeehaw!
last, we've reached the pinnacle of the Western. I hope people enjoyed hearing the actual play.
Yeah,
Getting to
that's fun.
getting to run a game I made with some people that I really like.
And also me.
Yeah, you're right. I
Alright.
tolerate you on a weekly basis.
That sounds about right.
I don't even know where to start. I think that's going to be my new montage for every single new season that we start.
Yeah, just say I don't know. I mean, you've said before that this has been a challenge to kind of lasso, if you will.
Oh,
Just because it's just a huge sprawling concept, right? Like, and it's also kind of a weird genre in the sense that it is very geographically bound as well as time bound, but that's been adjusting and moving over the years. Um, so like it's covering a very specific place and time, but it still has evolved a number of tropes that have since been transplanted into other genres successfully, but usually with hyphenations.
so as we've been trying, as you talked about, as I've been trying to figure out how to approach this, because this has been something I've been noodling on now for about, is it 4 months? With
I think in
various,
years. We talked about Western stuff like we first pitching the podcast to each other, so like it's been around for a while.
yeah, but I mean, like actually started working on. I've talked about a
Oh
bunch
yes,
of stuff.
yeah, that's also true. But yeah, no, in terms of actually planning it, yeah, it's been 4, maybe 5 months of what about this? What about this? What about this?
Because in different iterations, the one of them that I don't think I ever really showed Eddy had like 50 things on it. That had some
Right. I was saying
TV,
no.
it had some movies, it had actually some books, not necessarily books, but like some short stories from books specifically. And I was like, there's no way that I want to do this, much less I'm going to present this to Eddy for us to do.
Right.
So I went back and I reworkshopped it. And I think the longest one I showed Eddy was about 30 things, I think.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And that had film and TV.
Right. And then and I was like, I was just remembering when we did our superheroes run, which was about that long, if not a touch longer, and how we felt near the end of it. So I was like, I don't think that length is gonna work. I think that's when you kind of settled on films specifically.
Yeah. So that's when I did go back and I cut all the TV out, which was hard. It was hard cutting out Deadwood, cutting out Justified. Those are difficult
Gunsmoke.
calls to make. And Deadwood even popped into the film list once or twice. I could squeeze Deadwood in here. It's like, no. So in the end, the parameters I more or less gave myself for us to do, I was going to limit it specifically to the Western film genre, primarily set between like 1840 and 1880, essentially is where they're going to be set. And the exact location could vary some. But I was trying to parameter everything down to make it more approachable for us to do. And one of the other things I added that I didn't tell Eddy is that I wanted to limit it to one film per director. So we won't have the
Okay.
same director doing 3 or 4 films that pop up throughout here. There may be one exception somewhere that I may have overlooked, but primarily that's not going to happen. So for instance, I'm going to go ahead and say at the top, there's only going to be one John Ford film in this run. And people
Okay.
are probably aghast right now.
Well, sure, because westerns. It's funny because like a lot of people point to cinematic universes now as like a big new thing, but in a lot of ways, my understanding is that westerns, uh, uh, also some other genres, but westerns are a big one where once you get known for doing that kind of film, you kind of do a lot of that film. So like, if you are known as making someone who makes westerns, then you tend to make a lot of westerns. So that's kind of what happens. Um, Mexico had kind of a similar thing with El Santo. Uh, his films don't fit into a justifiable genre, except for there's also wrestling involved because he's a luchador. But once people were known to be making El Santo films, then that's just what they made. They made 50 of them, right? Yeah, I mean, I could see why there's a lot of overlap of like this director just makes a ton of Western films. They didn't really have the idea of something like you're James Gunn, you make superhero films now, right? It's probably a good real world analogy,
What, you don't want to say James Gunn makes Toxic Avenger movies from Trauma?
which is basically a superhero film, just slightly different.
Yeah, given the fact, I think in the original Toxic Avenger, they had Stan Lee doing a voiceover for Toxie.
Yep, yep. I mean, the original Toxic Avenger was supposed to be kind of a parody of superheroes because it's he said toxic waste and he gets superpowers and that but actually that's really terrible if you think 10 seconds about that. Um, and the Toxic Avenger is like, okay, let's talk about how stupid this is as a concept. So yeah, I mean, it's just another superhero film. We don't quite have the same kind of pigeonholing, but that's like the closest analogy. Um, Certainly during the James Bond run, we talked about how a lot of James Bond directors would stay on for like several James Bond films. So it's kind of roughly similar. So yeah, I could see why it'd be a particular challenge to kind of go, okay, I want to pick one film per director. Because I mean, just looking at this list, I could see that there's been a ton of different directors over
Yeah.
the genre.
And all right, I guess we'll take a little bit of a step back, but not too much, because this is going to be a lot more free formed than normal. Because even if Eddie looks at the note sheet right now that I made for this thing, it has like a random movie listed here. It might have one random bullet point here,
Right.
but it's more like talking points to launch off from specifically. And one of the big things though is like the Western genre made so many movies. I cannot tell you
Yeah.
how many movies it made. Even during the silent era, I want to say they made thousands. Was it thousands? I don't know. Thousands of Western films. For a long time, essentially the Western took about 30% of a Hollywood's production rate for
Damn.
decades. So there's so many Westerns. There were different types of Westerns, essentially. There was the B Western, and then there's like the A Western that we always talk about. The B Western were super cheap movies that they could play at a double feature. So essentially,
Hmm.
it cost them very little. Even the actors in the movie would potentially wear the same costumes for each movie. So they could then take cuts from the different movies and like resplice them to other things and
Oh
reuse that
wow.
footage. And it would play essentially after the big movie to get a B movie Western. So you have
Hmm.
like your movie here, then like a Western, and they were built for younger audiences. So like kids would go to the matinee on a Saturday and potentially be there for a full day.
Yeah, that makes sense. I know from the comics perspective, westerns were massively popular during comics. In fact, it was one of the last genres to die out before superheroes dominated American comics. Um, and there'd be lots of big 80-page comics coming out every month, and there would be tons and tons of different 1 to 7 page stories within, and they're all just variations of like what if cowboy? What if a cowboy but young? What if a cowboy but detective? What if a cowboy but girl? I mean, and just also the comedy westerns and dramatic westerns and horror westerns. Even uh, before we had this idea of hyphenated genre, Western was rapidly expanding. It's where the concept of weird Westerns actually came from, because they had to kind of pigeonhole what if Westerns also had other stuff in it, and that's kind of because of their. I believe they were mostly printed in Weird Tales, is where they kind of pick up the sobriquet of Weird Western. Um, but like, so you're right, because there's just so much of it, and each one was trying to differentiate itself and stand out from the crowd. So there's lots of, well, I understand, at least in comics and in pulp, lots of experimentation within westerns um, at a very, very early time.
And so much so that this is something that I put in Haunted West, but even I want to say the first black hero led comic was a Western comic, and it was Lobo.
Yep.
It was a like black soldier from the in the Union Army in like their adventures, and it was phenomenal if you go back and read it. Essentially, it's like
Mhm.
a black private who manages to get like a Confederate general's horse that becomes his, and he vows after the war never to kill anyone again. And he goes around doing good, doesn't kill anybody, and leaves a gold coin as a marker because he met like this mysterious person that like I want to fund you to go off and essentially be the Lone Ranger with gold pieces. And he goes off and does
Mhm.
all this stuff. And I put it in Haunted West, and it's amazing because Lobo is such a great concept, but there was so much pushback at the time because it came out, I want to say in the 60s, is that one of the rumors, and I'm going to stack it with that, is that the southern states would not buy and unpackage the comic and they sent them back and so there couldn't so that it would impact the sales, and Lobo only ran for 2 issues.
Yeah. I do know remember 2 issues. Um, and but even like the original Ghost Rider, right before it became a Marvel staple as a guy who rides a motorcycle, was originally a Western character, and as I understand, was actually owned by Marvel originally. Marvel inherited the rights, but the original Ghost Rider comics are still in public domain now. But weirdly, he was a guy that was supposed to be a supernatural character, and yet he wasn't. He was simply a vigilante that was using supernatural bullshit to scare people to make his vigilante job easier. Um, so I mean, yeah. So
as
there's just weird shit going on in this genre.
as we're prone to talk about comics, if we're going to talk about film, do you, for people that are curious who where they can find this Ghost Rider, if you go back and look at some in I want to say they're in the 30s of the West Coast Avengers run, Mockingbird, Moon Knight, and Tigra
Yeah.
have some issues with that Ghost Rider.
Yes, they do.
He's not a good dude.
Um, and if you're curious, so kind of put a cap on this because we're not talking about comics, but if you're also curious, Drive Through Comics, which is a great DRM free comic book store, they have quite a few companies who take these public domain comics and clean them up and then resell them for like a buck or less. And there's a bunch of you can get a whole bunch of Western comics on there for real cheap. The one I tended to look at was Omneric, and they have big like 200-page collections of these short little Western stories for like $2-3. So it, and they're good to kind of again give you a good slice of all these different things because really ultimately because again Western is weird. It's not really a genre. It is a time and a place and a set of tropes that can apply to such a wide variety of styles of story. And I assume as we go through film, but they do tend to cluster around action, adventure, and crime.
Okay, well then let's take a minute. We'll talk about some of the bigger general subgenres of the Western.
Okay.
There's like the acid Western. There's the Australian Westerns, black exploitation Westerns. They have Chinese Westerns, comedy Westerns. There's sort of a neo Western that's became more popularized in modern day. There's a documentary style Western. There's electric Westerns. There's like the epic Western, the European Western. There's musical Westerns. There's fantasy Westerns. There's gaucho, Greek, horror. There's hybrid Westerns. There's martial arts Westerns. I know I mentioned it again, but I want to say there are musical Westerns. Eddie,
Yeah.
and for those late nights, for people that are feeling frisky, there are even porn Westerns if you want to go down
Sure.
that route. Then we get to like revisionist Westerns, sci-fi Westerns. There are so many different types. And I'm going to end because I could keep going with two space and spaghetti Westerns. And I ended on
Yeah.
spaghetti for a reason because it's
No, totally.
huge.
And even then, like, there are other genres that have emulated westerns in a way that they are not comfortably packaged in western, but they still do have a lot of resonance. And the most iconic example is Akira Kurosawa. Quite a number of his samurai films were inspired by westerns, even though they have since become their own distinct genre of samurai film. But if you look at samurai films and western films together, there's a lot of overlap in their tropes and structure, and to the point where, again, famously, one of the samurai films was remade as a western, and most people know the Western more than they know the original samurai film it was based
Yeah.
off of.
And so much so, the impact of it, if you go and ask George Lucas, where did some of your inspiration for Star Wars comes from? He mentions Kurosawa movies. So
Mm-hmm.
its influence is staggering. Without the Western genre, we would not have the media, film media, and other genres that we have right now. I cannot stress enough how fundamental it is that it changed the world.
Yeah, I mean, I have argued that Sherlock Holmes was probably the first pop culture genre phenomenon, but the westerns was the first one that became uh, uh, first American grown one, but also the first one to expand so rapidly because it wasn't based around the character; it was based around again a place and a time, and there's so much you can do in that time. And so, yeah, westerns, although they started in America and are based around America, they are a global phenomenon, to the point where some countries are now well known for doing westerns better than America has. So, I mean, it's wild that this. On one level, it's wild that this has happened, but on the other hand, it's not that much different than Americans making films about British history or an anime about American culture. I mean, like, if something resonates with people enough, it doesn't matter what. Ideally, it doesn't matter what culture you're a part of. You can see something of yourself in them, and westerns certainly offer a lot for a lot of people.
And having said all that, I do want to take a minute. During this run, the big thing about Westerns is that they are going to primarily whitewash history. And they're going to cast a lot of negative light on a lot of different of marginalized groups because they're primarily the ones we're potentially covering, at least in the initial start of it, were made by white dudes that want to tell a story to sell to other white people to enforce their own narrative. And that's for me growing up, having watched a lot of Westerns, that was a constant in conflict with me because I grew up watching Westerns with my grandmother who loved Westerns, but a lot of the Westerns she liked to watch had the rebellious Confederate as their lead, who is a traitorous racist asshole.
Right.
And she, as from an older generation, couldn't see that for what it was. Even I, as a kid, was like, this is wrong.
Right.
And something I want to bring up even more now, given the current environment where we're in, where those assholes are in complete church.
Yeah, totally. And it's even worse than when we briefly touched on noir, because noir, a lot of their outdated tropes were primarily based around gender. This is there are lots of stereotypical archetypal roles that are based around a negative portrayal of race. So you're going to have Native American savages. You're going to have black slaves. You're going to have Mexican bandits, and that's unfortunate and wrong and terrible. But it is a trope that only recently, in the I say recently in the grand scheme of the Western genre existing, people have started to challenge. But there are bits and pieces of it, like you said with Lobo. There are other parts that have popped up and done that. For example, in I can go back to comics briefly, but in Britain there was a comic called Battle Magazine, right? And it was literally just what if war. And it's a whole kind of and anthology comics in Britain. We talked about this briefly with Judge Dredd. Basically, they do serialized 5 to 7 pages, 8 pages of narrative that go ongoing. But in a couple of them, they would have westerns. And one of them was El Mestizo, who was a Mexican who didn't fight, who during the Civil War didn't fight for either side, and basically used both sides to get his own way. But famously, it was drawn by a Spaniard, and he was the main creative thrust behind it. And that was in the late 70s, early 80s. Like you said, there are blaxploitation films in the 70s that tried to change this narrative as well. Um,
Like Sidney
Blazing
Poitier's
Saddles.
first,
Yeah.
well, Sidney Poitier's first directorial movie, if I remember right, was Buck and the Preacher, which was two black leads in a Western film, and it had Ruby Dee as a love interest, and the three of them on the screen doing great Western shit and fighting against different powers in like a Western background and setting. Like that, revolutionary, beautiful. If you haven't seen it, you should go see it. Maybe we're
Right.
going to cover it here. Maybe we're not. I'm not going to say what we're going to cover.
Because it might change.
We're about 98% locked in with this list.
Okay, all right, but still 2% wiggle room.
There's always 2% wiggle room.
Right. So before we go too deeper, I'm coming across like I'm super authoritative on this. I'm not. I have been learning very rapidly, partially from reading Haunted West, to be honest. But also, I want to put my cards on the table now, as it were. I grew up hating westerns. Unlike Chris, who grew up loving them, I grew up hating them. I had a father who really loved westerns. I did not have a good relationship with him, and so therefore I transposed my hatred of him onto the genre. Also, he was not a good entry point into the genre because he felt that westerns were just self-evident. It's like just shut up, just watch the film, shut up and read the book, kind of thing. Whereas I like to know I like to know context from media. That's why we've done this fucking podcast for 4 years. Because I like to overthink these things. So I did not start to appreciate westerns until the kind of neo-western revival in like the 90s, early 2000s. Specifically the movie Tombstone. I went to see it in the theater because my friends wanted to go see it. I really enjoyed it, and I was like, wow, I have just missed this entire genre. And slowly over the years, I have been picking at the edges of it and come to appreciate it over time. So a lot of these movies are going to be new to me. But also, I am coming at it from perspective of someone who's much more inclined towards the weirder edges of the Western genre. I'm certainly going to do my best to do my usual analytical stuff, but much like how I was kind of more or less driving a train during a Sherlock Holmes run, Chris is going to be doing a lot of the context giving. I'm going to be learning along with y'all as we listen to this Western run.
And taking that into account, one of the things I tried to do is why I focused on films, and specifically the ones we did, is that we can look at them more from the film aspect, and we have to worry about a lot of the historical context and a lot of other different media sources. So that's why it's film based for this entire run. And when I talk how it took me 4 months to figure out, originally I had them to be more of a straight classical style Westerns for a lot of stuff with minor variations. But since then, I've gone back and I've tried to look at it from a genreless perspective, how we put it together. So there's going to be different types of Westerns associated in there. Some of them are going to be really weird. One of them is going to be really bad. There's going to be some great stuff. And it's going to go in a lot of different directions, hopefully, if I pulled it off right.
Right. And yeah, I mean, I think the other thing is, we talked about it before, but just kind of put a cap on it. We usually try to call out isms. If we did that, that's all we'd be doing for 30 episodes. So I think we're just going to have to say, like, unless it's really egregious, we're going to kind of just, at least early on, kind of maybe just gloss over it. And then as we get closer to modern day, be more assertive, because as we closer to modern day, we should know better. I think we'd be more comfortable calling stuff out more. But we may also just call it out when we feel like it. I'm just saying.
Yeah, it's us. To get a little bit more back into like a general flow of the Western, how they worked, is a lot of the Western genre itself came out of the Wild West shows that Wild Bill was doing. Those started in the 70s/80s, 1870s, 1880s.
Right. To be clear,
it was so well. People were like, is it Wild Bill the zombie going around in like the 1900s? They were so popular that they actually got to go over, and I think they performed in front of like the Queen and things like that.
In fact, they were so popular that during the late Victorian era, it was actually trendy to get American spouses for upper gentry. And so there's this weird influx of Americans being married into the various different established families, which is super weird when that happens later on in this century and people got all fucking snappy about it. But we won't talk about that.
Could it be because there's something different about this American woman, Eddy, than the other ones?
I wonder what the difference could be, Chris.
Wasn't that she was a famous actress? That wasn't it.
Wasn't it she was American? Because plenty of both famous American actresses got married during the Victorian era, no problem.
So much so that this was popular enough that if you remember in our Sherlock run, one of the episodes of Sherlock that we watched had someone, because Eddy chose an episode for me, as part of a Wild West show, to be running around with Sherlock and Watson.
Yep. So it is entirely possible if you want to write a historically accurate story to have a story that has Sherlock Holmes, a cowboy, and a samurai in
Yeah, I love it. I love it so much.
it.
People just don't get it. So anyway, from that's when the Edison company sort of came around. They started filming some of those. They would have like
Mhm,
short clips that they would do, and they even have clips of Annie Oakley shooting a gun. In case people are curious, Annie Oakley is a super famous markswoman,
mhm.
exceptionally skilled. She was really young during the Western genre and kind of went on to later and had a lot of those sorts of things. Eventually, the first actual plot, and I use plot very loosely, dramatized Western was not made by the Americans. It wasn't made by the Edison
Really?
Company or any Americans.
Wow.
It was, in fact, a British studio that shot a silent film by Mitchell and Kenyon Film by the Kenyon Film Company in 1899. It's like 4 minutes, but a 4 minute film with a plot. And if anyone is curious, it's called Kidnapping by, I'm going to say indigenous, but that is not the word the film is called. You can go look for it yourself.
Right,
I'm never going to be derogatory. It's against my very nature.
right.
So the entire plot, the plot focuses on an attack by Native Americans on a camp where white people are staying. The attackers set fire to the camp and kidnap a young woman. Some cowboys arrive and a gunfight begins. Pew, 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 pew. The captured girl is rescued by the cowboys in the film.
Super exciting.
For Eddy, 1899.
Yeah. I mean, I'm joking, but also, that's actually pretty technically impressive for 1899, right, to put together.
Oh, I've never been there. Have you been to Blackburn? Because that's where it was shot.
No, I haven't been to Blackburn. I've it has a certain reputation, as I understand it, of being a cheap place to do things like film movies. So,
Are you saying that if there was a quarry, some Hoovians may be there?
probably. I've never been, and I'm sure people who actually live there will tell you that's quite lovely. But it's how these reputations places get reputations has always been opaque to me. It's like, why does, you know, Cleveland have a bad reputation? Why does Detroit have a bad reputation? You know, it's like, but what I've heard is that Blackburn has a similar reputation of like being a reasonably cheap place.
There are a bunch of jokes I could make that I'm gonna be more adult and not make. The other film that becomes like the most notable film, not saying that's not an achievement that it did, but the most notable film was actually going to be the Great Train Robbery in 1903.
That's the one I knew. Yeah, that's what I thought was the first one when we first talked about this.
The general plot of the Great Train Robbery. I'll give a more detail for this because I stole it from the Wikipedias. Uh, Two bandits break into a railroad telegraph office where they force the operator at gunpoint to stop a train and order its engineer to fill the locomotive tender at the station's water tank. They then knock the operator out and tie him up. It is boarded by the bandits. Two bandits enter an express car and open a box of valuables with dynamite. The others kill the fireman and force the engineer to halt the train and disconnect the locomotive. The bandits then force the passengers off the train and rifle through their belongings. One passenger tries to escape, but is instantly shot down. The bandits escape the locomotive, and the movie is still going on. The bound operator awakens but collapses again. His daughter arrives and she restores him to consciousness by dousing him with water. Look at this plot, Eddy. It is like,
Yeah.
there is some comic relief at a dance hall where an Eastern stranger is forced to dance while the local fire at his feet. The door suddenly opens and the telegraph operator rushes in to tell them about the robbery. The men form a posse quickly and chase the bandits through the mountains. The posse finally overtakes the bandits and kill them and recover all the stolen mail. A standalone scene titled Realism presents a medium close up of the leader of the outlaws who turns and fires his pistol point blank directly at the camera and the audience.
Hmm.
Boom! End of film.
Right. And now, I don't know if this is true. I feel like this is kind of just folklore, but my understanding is that part of the reason this film was made was to kind of show people the leaps and bounds of film technology, because this was supposed to be like the next generation of film technology. and because people didn't have, let's say people had media literacy then, but they don't have it now. But like they didn't understand how films worked. People were genuinely terrified of that, and a few people like fainted as a result of that scene.
From my understanding and recollection, that is correct.
Mhm.
Because the Western genre, I keep stressing how important it is. It was monumental in the evolution of film. Like this is how people learned a lot of the different techniques that will become
Mhm.
vital for other things. This is prime. This is before a lot of science fiction came out. Although a shout out to Metropolis 1921 or 27. Just saying there
Mhm.
now.
Yeah, that is a big silent film epic, isn't it?
So it's huge. I cannot stress enough how impressive this shit is. Ah, and it was this alone, like this film. The ending of this film is also what Martin Scorsese took to put into the Goodfellas. If you remember the Goodfellas, at the final scene of the movie is Joe Pesci, who died. Spoiler if you haven't seen the Goodfellas, then you should go watch movies. Joe Pesci got killed in the film, but it ends with Joe Pesci pulling a gun and firing at the audience.
Okay, I
And
never
it's
made
an
that connection, but
homage
now I
to
see why that.
this.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. And it's so, but you're right. Like, the ongoing joke slash disturbing reality is that the modern day, the biggest innovator in cinema and video is traditionally been porn. Um, that's, for example, one of the reasons why the it's true because
Oh, I'm sorry.
the
Am I
reason,
clapping?
yeah, the reason why VHS is one the videotape war is because a lot of porn companies invested in VHS over Betamax. Um, a lot of how cable became monetized was through finding ways to monetize porn through cable. But before that, my understanding is that westerns were the primary innovators in cinematography. So, like, if a lot of times if cinematography makes a leap forward until about the middle of the 20th century, it was because someone on a western was trying to do something cool.
Yes. And even when you're talking about how porn was a big innovator for technology, that goes back into reflection of the time, like a lot of westerns, where a lot of the predominant supporters of, like the backers of towns and communities, were frequently madams that ran brothels. Were the financial backing of towns. They were like
Hmm.
incredibly influential and powerful. People still look down on them, but without their money and what they did, their town or community would not be prosperous. So it is, fucking Americans who hate sex but adore violence. I just don't get it.
Yep.
I still do not get it to this day. It makes no sense.
Right.
I
So
didn't think we'd
kind
be
of help me
talking about
understand.
westerns and I go on a porn rant.
Well, I mean, I'm not surprised, because I mean, sex and violence, those are the two big axes of the American experience, and westerns tend to be on one side of that. Not exclusively, not entirely, but generally, westerns tend to be violent. And so, one of the things that I have been finding interesting as I kind of glance through how westerns have evolved, just again, like very cursory research, is how well they walk to that line of what we could present as violent. And um, uh, and actually, it may be worth talking about when we did the Sherlock Holmes run. I kind of broke everything down into decades, but I also talked about how the ebb and flow of Sherlock Holmes media worked. Has there been a similar ebb and flow in westerns?
To some extent. So all right, let's do this more analytical genre style then, if you will. We'll go back and we'll start with the silent era, which essentially was 1894 to about 1929. And during the silent era, that's when you had a surplus of Western movies being generated because they were easier to make. There was action. And the big thing I do want to point out about Westerns, and one of the reasons it was so popular, is that we're looking at this now, we're looking back at this time period. If you lived in like 1860, 1870, you'd survive the Civil War potentially.
Hmm.
And if you're still alive, you're watching movies about things that you experienced
Right.
a decade or two ago. And even if you were, say, born, we'll say in like 1890, your parents or grandparents are telling you their stories that you're now seeing on screen, which reinforces that narrative and how powerful that would be, even impactful for you.
Right. It would be like people today watching movies about 9/11.
Yeah. And so there's all of that. And given that there are limited other amusements in their free time, you could like read.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have radio quite yet.
Yeah, no, I guess like right at the end of the silent era is when radio starts getting big.
Yeah. And during this, Westerns were super popular. They like a big height. But then when we actually started getting talkie movies, the Westerns actually hit a slump. So people don't really talk about the slump that much. But during the talkies, Westerns went into decline. And that's when you got a lot more of the sort of B Westerns, and there were less of them produced. And John Ford has a long history that people don't really talk about either. It was Stagecoach that cemented John Ford's legacy and made John Wayne an A-list star. Before that,
Right.
John Wayne did a lot of B movies, like a lot of B Westerns. He was a stagehand. He was like moving shit around Hollywood. Well, we might talk about that later. And it was Stagecoach that propelled the Western back to popularity. So that's how we hit the golden age of the Western from the like 40s to the 60s.
Okay.
And that's when you get a whole bunch of movies. That's like when they're making up essentially a third of the Hollywood production rate. It's all Westerns. Westerns. That popularity, though, when we hit the mid-60s, meant that television had come into play, and then people were making a whole bunch of Westerns on TV.
Right.
And there was so much of it, in case people are curious. It's like now with superheroes. You can see superheroes in movies, you see them on TV. There's too much. So then you stop going to the movies to see it when you can watch on TV, which technically was cheaper. But now in the age of streaming, that's vastly different.
Right. Well, right.
You need
Yeah.
87 streaming services to do what network television used to do.
Right. And that's assuming you don't decide to stop supporting one because of stupid decisions they made recently or whatnot.
Correct. And if you didn't, you should. But streaming services who supposedly didn't have commercials now have commercials, and they make you pay a higher fee. I could go on a whole other rant about streaming services that will pull in. Anyway.
Well, actually, I think it's relevant to what you're talking about here because the push and pull that was kind of happening at that time was, yes, you could watch Westerns on television, but they had commercials. And whereas you could go to the cinema, and yes, there were also commercials. There were ads between the features, but they're not too similar to how we do it now. But you can watch the whole Western without advertisements, right? So like, and I think we've talked about this before about films in the 40s and 50s. There's still a cachet in the sense of seeing a Western on TV was seen as kind of good enough, slightly low rent, whereas a Western on the big screen was still a big deal. It wasn't until the 60s when television production quality started ramping up that it's okay, something on TV is actually pretty good. And so I'm not making do by watching on TV. It's actually a very satisfying experience. And so that's when the 60s had to kind of go even bigger and more bombastic. And that's why franchises like James Bond, we just talked about, became popular because they brought that bombast in a very natural way.
That's a great segue for where I was about to go. And so in the mid 60s, and when the rise of Westerns on TV, also that's when the spy-fi genre really hit. Like the spy genre really hit. And that started undercutting the Western itself. And that's why you get shows like Wild Wild West, that was a Western realizing our genre is dying. The spy genre is elevating. Let's combine them to this one to make this hybrid Western show to keep our fans going. I think the Wild Wild West ran for 4 or 5 seasons.
Quite a while, yeah.
And so the spy genre overtook the Western genre. And the Western technically has never died off, because when you get to the late 60s through 70s, they had sort of a revival that came out. And we get a lot more of the acid Westerns in the 70s genre. Like that's where we get it. In the mid 60s, we got like a lot of the different spaghetti Westerns from like Italy. And it's a whole thing. If we do spaghetti Westerns, we'll talk about spaghetti Westerns.
Right.
And to the 80s, there was like a sputter of Westerns that were coming out. But pretty much the Western genre has never been as successful as it was back then. It won't die. It's like on its constant last legs. And in the 90s, we get some actors that really love Westerns that tried to go back and revitalize them, like Kurt Russell, Kevin Costner, are known for loving Westerns and that's when they had their stuff in the 90s trying to make it still didn't happen. But we also get some other great westerns in the 90s that try to do different things, like God, I forgot what it's called, but it stars Sharon Stone by Sam Raimi. Anyway, 90s.
Right.
Go all the way up to the 2000s, where we keep trying to get the westerns back, we'll never hit it, but we're just getting into like more neo westerns in the late 90s to 2000s, and that's kind of sort of became a stick where people really tried to go forward. Later in the 2010s to 2020s, we get other people trying to revitalize westerns again, stuff like Django Unchained, the Ballad of Buster Scruggs, if you want to watch that, things like that. So it doesn't die, but it will never. I don't want to take that back. It hasn't hit or resonated how it used to. But part of it is because you're telling a story primarily focused on a certain time period of history that people don't know how to approach because of the genocide on some level associated with it. On the other side, other people feel pride because it helped them build their country, but then you have to take into account the people that made it work and happen are frequently overlooked or erased. So people haven't figured out the right balance between historical accuracy, fun, exciting, excellent adventure, and mass appeal.
Right. And honestly, Victorian England has a similar problem in the sense that it has been used so much by media that when people try to inject actual history into it, pop culture tends to reject it because they only know that time period through previous media. So uh, we talked a little bit about uh, uh, during Sherlock Holmes run. What was the horror one? Uh,
Hound of the
the
Baskerville?
Irregulars. The Irregulars.
Oh,
And it's like, yeah, hey, the Irregulars. Like, there's a lead of color, and they had a lot more diverse casting. And a lot of people reacted negatively to that, and it's like that's actually kind of what Victorian England looked like. That's not color washing it. That's just getting closer to where it actually was. But people are so used to seeing white Victorian England, and same thing with westerns. Like it's like black fella couldn't be a cowboy. It's like plenty of black cowboys. So
funny
like
enough
it's ridiculous.
that you mentioned that.
Mhm.
Uh, the actual origin of cowboys is that they were black people, and they called them boys because boys is a very derogatory term.
Right. Hmm.
Until it became popular enough that then it became a white story.
Right. Are you saying that white people co-opt black culture and turn it into their own benefit? I'm shocked, Chris.
I'm just saying it. It's
But yeah, so yeah, the westerns are a bit weird because you're right. If because we know more now, um, if you were to make an accurate western while still keeping the tropes, people might bounce off of it because that's not how they understand westerns to work. If you make it too authentic, it becomes more of a documentary, and that has its own challenges in the marketplace. And if you keep it to what people believe pop culturally a western should be, you don't get innovation, and also it doesn't move the narrative forward. The last big pop culture reinvention of the western I could think of, frankly, is Deadwood,
I
where they
would
kind of
say
reinvented
Django
it to be
Unchained.
well. I mean, okay, fair. I didn't
Or
I didn't cover that just because it was actually a remake of an existing set of films. But you're right in that regard. How they presented it was definitely another step forward.
and I know that people are probably come in and ask, specifically they come and specifically ask me, what about The Harder They Fall? And that was a Netflix movie.
Okay.
I may talk about it. I may not talk about it. People that have followed me online know that I have issues with that movie from the sheer utter abundance of any historical accuracy whatsoever.
Right.
But it was a stylized movie that tried to move the narrative forward.
And that's another weird thing about westerns is like you said, when it was first coming out, it wasn't historical. It was contemporary or near within living memory. So like it was recent events. And so they were just telling stories that happened to use things that most people would be at least passively aware of because it was within, their parents would have known that, or their grandparents at the outside. Um, so and then it just kind of stuck around. So like I'm personally totally fine with completely historically inaccurate westerns as long as that they know going in that's what they're doing, right? It's the you know I am terrible with memory today. That's what I get for not having notes. But the show we watched for the Patreon, um, the '90s Western show, sci-fi Western
Oh, you
show.
mean Briscoe County Jr.?
Basic Engineer, thank you. Oh my god. My apologies, listeners. I've had a really rough week, so my brain's everywhere. But Briscoe County Jr. Was in no way, shape, or form trying to be historically accurate, right? But also, it made it. It was very clear to the audience. Okay, now this is just a fun western. We're not even bothering with historical accuracy. We're going to play with history occasionally, but ultimately, we're just having fun here. Wild Wild West is actually another good example of the movie as well as the TV show. This is just fun steampunk shit functionally. Um, then that's fine. But because it's also now a historical genre, you also have the kind of component of like weird accuracy. Does it need to be accurate or not? And like westerns get a pass that other historical genres don't get, but also it is judged more harshly than other historical genres.
Yes. And part of that complication, though, comes from who is primarily telling the stories.
Right.
If you have the stories only told from a very certain perspective, those are the ones that will have more play overall. And that's what people will constantly associate that genre with.
Hmm.
And that is part of the problem that hasn't been solved yet. For instance, there are some really popular Westerns right now on TV that people love.
Hmm.
And that's all coming from like essentially one company. And that one company has a review of how it should work. And so that's what they're putting out. It works gangbangers for them, which is awesome for them. But there should be a counter narrative at the same time telling a different sort of story. But there isn't enough space in existence for that or support for those counter narratives because people are so used to this idea that's been forced on them now for a century of what a Western should be.
Right. And related to that, one of the things we talked about during James Bond run was that James Bond ultimately is a British conservative icon. No matter how much you enjoy or have fun with those movies, ultimately on some level, it's wasn't the world better when the British Empire was in charge? Is ultimately what the underlying narrative of the James Bond movies are, except for the Daniel Craig movies where it's like, no, seriously, England's fucked up. Let's just not even bother anymore. Um, but westerns are the same way, right? It's very much the American myth, and it's like, everything was great when America properly existed, when white people took control of everything. And so like it's irreducible from the core historical moments and that level. So like there's a certain amount of conservative elements that you can't completely excise unless you start to break this fossilized version of what the genre needs to contain. If it just happens to be a historical story set during a time period that divests all of the trappings of the Western, then you get something like the Kung Fu Show, which was fantastic. The remake, not the original Kung Fu, but the remake one. Um, it's fantastic, but it's set in that time period, it's set in the West, but it is so completely different from what people see as a Western that it's not counted in the same bucket.
And as someone that produced a Western book with a bunch of history and also had Weird West in it, so you could play it any way you want to, I cannot stress the amount of pushback I got from people not wanting to accept that this is historical accurate. These are the people that made up the West.
Mhm.
And there was a lot of evil done, primarily by white people, not only by white people, but primarily. And they didn't want to address or associate or go into that. They wanted to have this fossilized narrative that they believed where they were all good people. And
Right.
the big thing that I personally love about the concept of the West is that in the West, you could live in one town and get up and walk two or three towns over and restart your entire existence and become someone new.
Sure.
There's a magic in that. And like that is part of the American myth since America went and stole this land from the indigenous people that were here to make it what it is now. And There's something about the idea of being able to like make yourself whoever you want to be with hard work. That is like the fundamental myth of America. And it is a myth because it
Right.
never happens and it never works.
Right. But myths have value, myths have importance. And having that idealized world that you're saying where like I could do this is inspiring and gives hope, and that's one of the reasons why art does what it does. Is it appeals to our better selves as well as pointing out the hypocrisies and inadequacies of the world. Um, it's frustrating to me that so much of this is lumped with the epitaph of neo-Western, as if it is not exactly a Western. When, to your point, a lot of these stories ultimately do tap into that core base, exciting component of Westerns, but because it divests itself of this, like I keep saying, because it's useful, these fossilized tropes that have not progressed. It's like, how is this lesser than? When in fact it's actually getting to the core of it better than the other stuff that's coming out that more adequately apes this older art form. It's like, yeah, Western should be about freedom. It should be about living the way you want. It should be about doing the right thing even when it's hard. There's a lot of overlap with noir differences that Westerns, in my experience, noirs are bad choices that ultimately lead to ruin. Westerns are hard choices that ultimately lead to success, um, even if there's a price to pay. And so there is a heroism that comes with a core Western, from my experience with it, that can be very exciting and fulfilling if done correctly. So I do feel like there is space for this, but it's frustrating that culture has not accepted that.
And if people want a more specific, like drill down to what some of those core tropes are, it's essentially a lone protagonist, frequently a lone protagonist, who is almost a knight errant type figure that can go out and perform justice and do what needs to get done. A lot of that then boils down to said protagonists having to sacrifice themselves for the greater good of the community. But by doing the acts they had to do, they are no longer fit to be a part of the community that they just saved, and so they then
Hmm.
have to continue to move on. That is an inherent, like the inherent underlying trope. It's a bunch of moral choices that someone has to make hard calls, but that person makes hard calls for the community, but can't be a part of that community anymore.
Yeah. And so again, because this is genreless, I would point out that that story also maps well to Arthurian myth, to lone samurai stories. Like, one of the best quote unquote Western stories from that perspective is actually Yushaji Yojimbo, because it's about a lone protagonist who travels to different locations and brings justice, often against his best interest, because he brings an outside perspective of justice, that other people then chase him out of because he is a Ronin and therefore not fit to be part of common society. So yeah.
And as we are genreless, let's even make it more genreless by saying that also slots perfectly well with Bill Bixby's The Incredible Hulk. He would go to different towns, constantly wandering. The
Yeah.
Lonely Man song, because we can't have an episode without talking about the Lonely Man song.
Right.
He'd go into town trying to like lead a normal life, end up having to essentially Hulk out to do good, but then have to leave that town.
Yeah. Um, because I think, I've reductively called a lot of American myth ultimately boils down to road trip stories, and I think a lot of stems from the Western. You know, I mean, you could argue that the Supernatural series ultimately is a Western from that definition. So I mean, it can get ridiculous when you take a reductive look at the genre and apply it. It's like, okay, well, that doesn't really work. But that's one of the reasons why our whole point of this podcast is that genre ultimately is a stupid concept, but it has value to judge stories. And that's one of the things I think what's going to be exciting about this is because like we're going to judge stories from your definition, films that are set in a very specific slice of time, and show how these things line up and are similar, and how these things line up and are very different from each other.
Beautifully said. Anything else for this introductory episode that we wanted to tell people our rambling thoughts about the Western genre, a film? I'm specifically saying film.
Well, I mean, I think job done. We have definitely rambled about westerns for quite a while. Um, uh, uh, I mean, I have some specific questions, but I mean, I think those are better suited for a wrap up once we've actually watched a bunch of these and dig into the elements of genre. Um, I guess one thing I do want to maybe not ask, maybe just kind of talk about real quick, is that one of the things I'm hoping that we will see throughout all of this is because Westerns were so ubiquitous in the early part of the 20th century at the same time that people were learning how to watch films. I'll be interested to see how the fundamental structure of Western films changed to adapt to growing and changing uh, viewer tastes, or don't, or maybe they don't adapt. And maybe it's one of the reasons why we have some of the lulls we talked about is because they don't adapt to changing viewer tastes. I'll be curious to track that progression as we go through.
That'll be awesome. So that would also then make me definitely want to talk about. I think it's called Heaven's Gate, a 1980s film,
Okay, I've not heard
and
of
I'm
this
going to
one.
leave it at that. I'll leave it as a
Okay,
cliffhanger. People that know Heaven's Gate will say, "Oh, Chris is talking about that." If they don't know it, then you don't know. You have to wait until we talk about it.
yeah, I don't know, so I'm excited to find out what this is all about.
So
Uh,
the next episode,
yes.
unless you have something else before I tell them
No,
what it is.
I was about to ask you what the next episode was, so you're on top of it.
I said we're only going to do one John Ford film. And I went back and forth for a long time. But to start this run, I didn't do Harlem on the Range or like Harlem on the Prairie, which was like a 1937 film by Race Films Company that made like a whole bunch of like black westerns with singing cowboys because
Wow.
the lead wasn't. It's a longer story that if you really want me to cover those, ask and maybe we'll cover it on the Patreon. But instead, I'm going to go with the seminal classic by John Ford, Stagecoach, 1939, because I don't think we could start a Western run without talking about Stagecoach.
Awesome. And if people wanted to talk to you about Stagecoach or Westerns in general, and where they want to find this 800-page tome of Western knowledge, where they talk to you and where they find you.
So before that, Eddie, I want to end this episode with a quote
Oh,
after you're done telling them where to find
oh,
you
I'm
to, to,
sorry.
to show people how little time we prepped today. Eddie didn't even know when to do this. So that's why I
No,
waited till
no,
now to bring it up.
there's nothing in my notes about this. That's all new.
And if I botch it, that means Eddie has to like drop this whole recording and have to record it again and
No, we're not
again
doing that.
and again till it's right.
God, no, we've done that once before already. We're not doing it again.
If you're looking to buy Haunted West, you can come to my website, darkstudios.com. Pick it up. It's a great tome. It'll teach you historical accuracy, give you Weird West, lots of gameplay. If you want to contact me, you can hit me at Blue Sky at dark_Hugh or join the Discord where I think I'm talking about the Traveler game I'm playing in right now. And
Awesome.
I'm promoting Arc Dream stuff if people are curious by having conversations about it and how excited I am reading The Black Company.
Yeah. As for me, you can find me at pugsteady.com. That's my website. That's where you can find me on Blue Sky. If you're interested in more Western stuff, I know Onyx Path is going to be coming out soon with They Came from the RPG Anthology, which covers all sorts of movie genres. Frequent guest Matthew Dawkins was the developer on that. I did not work on the Western chapter, but there's a Western chapter in there. Um, I worked on the fighting game chapter. So, I mean, that's pretty much me in a nutshell. Yeah, so check out those games out if you're interested in more Western stuff. But other than that, we will end with your quote.
And if people are curious, I didn't work on the Western chapter either. When Americans tell stories about themselves, they set those stories in the West, American heroes or Western heroes. And when you begin to think of the quintessential American characters, they're always someplace over the horizon. They're always someplace in the West where something wonderful is about to happen. And even when we turn that around, even when we say, well, something has been lost, what's been lost is always in the West.